I think what the United States did that it had to do was invade Afghanistan to depose the Taliban, which was leading a failed state and sheltering al-Qaeda. The military mistake it made was becoming distracted by Iraq, which was not central in any way to terrorism or to September 11th, and neglecting Afghanistan as a result for gains that now are not insignificant but are hard to justify in terms of the costs. But where we went wrong, I think, is not recognizing that as a result of 9/11, we should have seen that hatred for the United States and the Muslim world was a serious problem. And I think at a moment when we have the sympathy of the world and we're in a very good position to address that problem, we didn't. We did a lot of things that exacerbated it. I think just by being elected, Barack Obama reversed quite a lot of the ill will that George W. Bush had created. I think we got sort of halfway back to where we were before in terms of the world's respect, the world's admiration for America. But then some of the damage that Bush's response to September 11th and the invasion of Iraq did is, I think, can't be really undone, except perhaps for a very long time. So there is a laborious process of going back to the idea of alliances, of cooperation, of America as perhaps the lead partner, as a global actor, but not a unilateral actor. I think something is changing. I think some Democrats, liberals, liberal American Jews are moving a little bit away from their automatic defense of Israel's actions. I think they're very much out of sympathy with the Netanyahu government, as certainly the Obama administration, as the senior officials in the administration who happen to be Jewish, like Rahm Emanuel, Obama's chief of staff, and David Axelrod, his chief political advisor. I think it's hard to question the Zionist sympathies of both of them. Rahm Emanuel served as a volunteer for the Israeli army when he was a younger man. He's practically Israeli himself. But they're just fed up with Netanyahu, and in particular, they're fed up about the settlements policy. And I think the settlements policy is the thing that has done more to alienate Israel's American sympathizers and really sacrifice the moral high ground that Israel ordinarily has in the situation. I don't think Israel's unwilling to negotiate. I think it's very open to negotiations. I think it would like to negotiate. I think it feels that it doesn't have a negotiating partner. Of course, there's blame to go around both sides. But at a time when you have probably the most sympathetic and moderate Palestinian leadership in the West Bank you've ever had in Abu Abbas and Salman Fayyad, your prime minister, who has a background in economics, who is a pragmatist, who is, doesn't come out of any sort of connection to terrorism. You have an Israeli government that is more intransigent and probably much more skeptical about the possibilities of peace. Netanyahu sort of represented the idea that you couldn't have a two-state solution. He's now endorsed the idea of a two-state solution. He sort of had to after he was elected and after he was pushed by Obama. But I think I'm fairly skeptical about how deeply he really accepts that that's the inevitable outcome. But I don't think Hamas is a very plausible negotiating partner. I do think that the Palestinian Authority leadership is. The question is whether they can deliver the public, whether they can make a deal and stay in power. It's what Arafat thought he couldn't do. I mean, he thought that if he agreed in the end to the Camp David Accords, he would be killed. I mean, he wouldn't be able to do it. Whether he wanted to do it was sort of beside the point. I think Gaza in particular, Israel's military response was disproportionate. And I don't believe that Israel targets civilians or ever has, but it killed a lot of innocent civilians by accident in Gaza and did tremendous damage. Really flattened parts of that, very desperate place. And in Lebanon too, I think, a justified reaction, but a disproportionate reaction has cost Israel some of the moral high ground.
So you've written in the context of the US about the positive way in which the positive force of the nationalism can be a sense of the nation and of acting together as a nation. there is a tension, and proposing, is there a tension, and do we see it in Israel? Is there a moment at which nationalism turns away from that positive view of acting together and building a human rights-based democracy, and turns towards something that becomes inevitably exclusive, exclusionary, etc.?
Oh, I thought you were going to say the opposite in Israel, that a lot of people who once upon a time would have been idealistic Zionists or kibbutzniks or people who believe in the country have turned much more inward and are focused on their own lives and on, Israel's this tremendous model of entrepreneurship. It has more startups per capita than any country in the world. It's sort of a mini Silicon Valley. Its economy is really booming as a result. And to me, one of the things that signifies is a lot of people quite reasonably giving up on the idea that this peace process is going to lead to anything, regardless of whose fault it is. And of course, there's fault on both sides, and getting on with their lives.
So the opposite of an aggressive nationalism, as it were, it's a sort of introspective nationalism, and therefore the problem is left to those whom it shouldn't be left to.
Well, you have both of these things happening side by side, and part of the reason I think a lot of people in Israel, and I should say I'm not someone who's spent a lot of time there or knows that society very intimately. I spent a summer there when I was 15 years old, when it was a very different place before the first Lebanon war. But partly because the Israeli political system has this flaw in it, that it gives power to extreme parties. No, the mainstream parties can't form a government on their own. So these very small religious parties have this power that's disproportionate to their numbers. And I think that's one of the things that turns many Israelis off of politics. I mean, in New York or Los Angeles or Silicon Valley, these places are filled with Israelis. And they're not particularly interested in politics. And I think many of them are not particularly committed to Israel. They've gone where the economic opportunity is. But of course, there's a lot of economic opportunity there as well for them. I think that if Obama does nothing else, he will have been a consequential president. I mean, when you step back from this a moment, the consequences, the stakes of it are absolutely enormous. Every Democratic president for the past 60 years has tried to pass national health care and failed, starting with Harry Truman, continuing with John F. Kennedy, Johnson. Nixon supported a national health care bill and couldn't get it passed. Carter, Clinton, of course, epic effort that shaped his presidency, failing in that. And so that big unfinished piece of business, that unfinished part of the American welfare state, which none of these otherwise, in many cases, very successful presidents have been able to make happen, Obama has now made happen just past the first-year mark of his presidency. So that is, I think, is a tremendously big deal. The political consequences are another question. It could be like Johnson's passage of civil rights bills in the mid-1960s, which morally were tremendously good thing, but politically were a very bad thing for the Democratic Party. But I don't think that's a given for Obama. I think in fact, I think it may be in the short term politically. In the short term, I think it helps politically because it gives him a boost to have gotten a win. He needed a win, and his numbers, I think, are going to go up. Then there's the question of what will happen in our midterm elections in November of 2010. And there, he's certainly poised to lose seats. Presidents almost always do lose seats in Congress in their first midterm election. If he loses 20 seats in Congress and the House, it'll be seen as a victory for him. If he loses control of the House or Senate, it will be a big defeat. We don't really know. I don't really know how to predict that. I think he's certainly much better off going into that election